as usual, like last week, we'll have a discussion. Now you can put any question that you have regarding astrophysics or cosmology on the chat, or you can share any link or paper that you may have come across. I already see Viz have put up a paper, so we'll go through that paper first. But meanwhile, if someone else has any question or anything, they can put it up on the chat. Yeah. Okay, I'll try to share my screen again. Okay, this is an interesting paper. Yeah, Liz, you had a couple of questions, right? So you can unmute yourself and ask if you want. Liz, are you there? Or did he left? Oh, he left. Okay. Okay, but so I hope all of you heard about this event called GW, I guess 1905-21. Did you all hear? You can just unmute yourself and say something if you want.
No.
Okay. Yeah, so JW nothing means gravitational wave, and 19 mean 2019, 05 mean what's it? January, February, March, April, May 21st. So it means they observed this event on May 21st, 2019. So that's the naming convention of LIGO. This is how they can, supposing if there are two events which are found on the same day, then they'll just name it as A and B. Supposing if this was the first event that was detected on May 5th, May 21st, 2019, then they would have named it as GW 1905-21A, and the second event as GW 1905-21B. So why this is so special is because the black holes, right, that are involved in this gravitational event are actually very heavy. So like regularly when okay yeah, so when people have actually observed black hole mergers regularly, so the masses of the black holes, of the individual black holes, used to be around 20-30 solar masses. But then just recently, so you see this, right? This is a good way to look at things. It's loading. Yeah, so you see this, right? So masses in the stellar graveyard. So if you actually look at this, usually, okay, just give me a minute. I think okay, so as you see here, what's happening is all these are neutron stars. So neutron stars usually have masses between 1.4 solar mass and 2.52 solar mass. But so far people have found neutron stars which are between 1.1 solar mass and 2.1 solar mass. So all the yellow things, that yellow dots that you see are nothing but neutron stars. And all those yellow things are neutron stars which are detected using electromagnetic counterparts, like the maybe X-ray or some gamma ray, some or radio waves, etc. And these orange ones are the ones which are found using gravitational waves, which is the famous GW 170817, wherein they detected two neutron stars orbiting around each other and colliding into them. And even they happen to be in the range of 1.1 to 2.1 solar mass, where solar mass, as you know, right, 1.989 in times 10 power 30 kgs. So both of them combined to give out a remnant object with a mass of around 2.7 or something, I guess. But we don't know exactly what this remnant is. It's mostly a black hole. Uh, and now that we're done with neutron stars, and the next violet things that you see, those are the black holes that people have found using electromagnetic counterparts again. Some X-rays through accretion disk around those black holes, um, or tidal disruption events where you have a regular stars getting disrupted by the black hole, and that creating an X-ray flare or a gamma ray counterpart launching a jet, etc. That's how they found all these black holes. But when you come to the black holes that are detected by LIGO, which are obviously a binary setup because gravitational waves are produced by a binary black hole setup, these are the mass ranges that I've observed, usually between 10 to 40. By 10 to 40, I mean the individual masses of the black holes. Like each black hole had a mass around 10 to 40. But turns out in this GW, uh, what's a 190521, they found individual black holes with masses around, if you see here, uh, this one, around 85 solar mass and 66 solar mass. So those are very huge, right? And so in astrophysics, there is something called mass cap. There are two mass caps, lower mass cap and upper mass cap. Okay. And supposing I can go back to this. Yeah. So they have two mass caps called lower mass cap and upper mass cap. Stellar remnants. Yeah, so I think this can be a good, I think it's the same one. Like I'm trying to get something particular, but I don't think I have that here. But yeah, so as you see, there are no objects between 2 to 5 solar mass, right? I mean, it's very less populated. So people don't really know if there are even objects in this certain interval, like between 2.5 and 5 solar mass, around that. Because observationally, they haven't found, but there is no physical process which will actually inhibit nature to form stellar remnants between these 2.5 to 5 solar mass. It's just we didn't find. We don't know exactly why we couldn't find, because that's still an open question. But using LIGO, we already found one such object, because before LIGO, if you actually see, all the neutron stars that have been found are below 2 solar mass almost, right? So it was strongly believed that there was a mass cap where there is no object remnant, a stellar remnant, which is a black hole or a neutron star with such masses. But once LIGO has been set up, people have been, through LIGO, physicists have been finding more and more remnant objects like black holes and neutron stars in between 2 and 5 solar mass. This is not the up-to-date chart. I tried finding, but yeah, sorry for that. But this is not the up-to-date chart. But yeah, people have found, but then now people no longer believe that there is a lower mass cap, but there is something else called upper mass cap, where upper mass cap is range between 67 solar mass and 130 solar mass. So people actually believe that there might not be any black holes between 67 and 150 solar mass forming. And there is actually a physical process which can actually inhibit nature from making them, unlike the lower mass cap. So in upper mass cap, the physical process that can actually inhibit the process of not forming these, the process which inhibits not forming these black holes within the mass range of 67 and 140 solar mass is called pair instability supernova. Okay. So if you want, I can just, yeah. So I'm just typing it out. Pair instability supernova. You can just Google it if you want later. Pair instability supernova. So turns out, due to this pair instability supernova process, one might actually not produce black holes between the 67 and 150 solar mass. But turns out this GW 190521 goes completely against of what we have understood. This actually, if you see, the mass of the black holes is in 85 and 66. Like supposing even if you consider the error bars on the masses, and if you look at the secondary mass, a secondary mass is nothing but in a binary, whichever black hole or whichever body whichever star has a lesser mass is called secondary, and whichever star has a higher mass is called primary mass. So here the primary mass will be M1 and secondary mass will be M2. So if you can actually take the error bars present on the secondary body, that one may say that it's outside pair instability supernova, that it may have actually be formed due to something called core collapse supernova. Okay. But if you look at the primary mass, even if you consider the error bars, it's well deep inside the upper mass cap. So how do you explain the formation of this upper mass cap, the black hole which is in the upper mass cap? Because according to our theory and understanding, due to pair instability supernova, this should not have formed in the first place. So how did it at all form, right? So that's the main question that people are trying to understand now. What are the astrophysical processes that are possible to explain how this black hole might have formed and how this black hole might have coupled with a secondary black hole so that they combine together and produced the gravitational waves which are detected by LIGO on this May 21st, 2019. And one more thing is, during a LIGO event, one actually observes something called inspiral merger and ring down wave a part of the waveform. So if you see, what's a good plot? Yeah, let's just go with this. Yeah, so if you can look at this, yeah. So this part of the waveform, right, till here, like till some 1400 or something, it's called inspiral. And after that, you see this peak, right? And this peak and the surrounding region is called merger, and the rest of the stuff is called ring down. Okay. And whenever you actually observe a waveform or a gravitational wave event, you tend to observe the inspiral part, the merger part, and the ring down part of the gravitational waveform. But in the case of JW 190521, since it's a very heavy event, right? So, like there is a relation between the gravitational wave frequency and the total mass of the binary, okay? And as you increase the total mass of the binary, the frequency of your gravitational wave keeps decreasing, okay? And LIGO can only detect like frequencies which are between 10 hertz and 1000 hertz. Like if I can just type PST of LIGO so that you can get a nice plot of this. Maybe this. Yeah, maybe let's try this. So this is called sensitivity curve. Okay. I'm just trying to find something good. Yeah, I think this should. Yeah. So if you look at this plot, right, this plot, this is not, okay. Okay, this is PSD. So if you actually look here, so whenever your event, right, like the frequency associated with it, with your gravitation wave is more uh, than what say, so um, so the higher the PSD, the higher the possibility that your gravitation wave is actually detected. Okay. And you see that this value of PSD actually varies with respect to frequency. It means at certain frequencies, you can observe the gravitational wave better compared to the other frequencies. Okay. And as I said, in the case of GW 1905-21, since the total mass was around 140 solar mass, right? 85 plus 67 is somewhere around what? 152, yeah. Somewhere around 152 solar mass. So being it so heavy, the frequency will be very less. Okay. And if the frequency is actually less, uh, and if you see as you go to lower and lower frequency, uh, the PSD actually increases. So I meant to say if the PSD is less, the event will be, the gravitation wave will be better detected at that particular frequency. So as you see, it's 100 hertz. And if you go to below 10 hertz or so, the PSD actually increases so much. It means the noise increases so much that you cannot really detect your gravitational signal at that particular frequency. Okay. And one more thing to note is frequencies, the gravitational frequency is not only dependent on the total mass of your binary, it's also dependent on the distance between your two binary objects. Okay. And as the distance between the two binaries keep decreasing, the frequency also increases. So if you keep the distance fixed and you increase the mass, the frequency decreases, okay, of the gravitational signal. But if you keep the masses fixed, the total binary mass is fixed and you decrease the distance between them as they're orbiting around each other, then the frequency keeps increasing, okay. So turns out when this binary was actually in the inspiral part of the waveform, inspiral part of the orbital evolution, the distance was so huge and the masses were so huge that the frequency was very less and it was below 10 hertz. And since it's below 10 hertz, LIGO couldn't detect the inspiral part of the waveform. But as the mass is fixed and the masses started orbiting around each other and coming close and close to each other, the frequency started increasing. And as the frequency starts increasing, the noise keeps decreasing and the event will be detected, right? So in the case of GW 1905-21, they only detected the merger and the ring down part of the gravitation signal, because only at those places in the orbital evolution could actually one get a frequency, a high frequency, which is above 10 hertz, so that it can be detected with the LIGO band. So those are the main takeaways of this. And we don't yet know whether the black holes were spinning or non-spinning yet. The only short thing that we know are the masses of them. And the distance is also pretty huge. If I remember correctly, it's somewhere around some gigaparsec. Don't think they mentioned it here, but yeah. So people are trying to explain the formation of this binary and the evolution of this binary using different astrophysical processes like primordial black holes, etc. Okay, people put some questions here. Yeah, so one possible explanation as to how, as Nishan pointed out, how this GW 1905-25 might have actually formed is something called hierarchical mergers. Meaning, supposing you have this cluster of stars, right? And there is a different types of classification for clusters, okay. And there's a type of cluster called globular cluster. So a globular cluster is any cluster which is densely packed and very irregular in shape. So such a cluster is called globular cluster. And it may happen that in such a globular cluster, initially two black holes which have masses below the upper mass cap, maybe some 30 and 50 solar mass black holes, they might have combined, giving rise to the 85 solar mass black hole. Okay. And then this 85 solar mass black hole may have got a kick. So when these two black holes actually combine, right? Sometimes when you have a high mass ratio system, meaning the masses of the two black holes are not equal and they're unequal. And if the inequality is very high, then those are called high mass ratio systems. You get something called kick. Like when these two black holes actually combine, the remnant black hole that's formed, it gets a huge kick velocity so that it flies away. And in the case of the 50-30 solar mass black hole, they might have combined, giving rise to this 85 solar mass black hole with a huge kick, which may have flown away in that globular cluster and interacted with a new black hole, which has mass around 67 solar mass, formed a binary, and that what may have caused this GW 190521. But the problem with that hierarchical merger scenario is that the probability that you actually have this black hole to form first and then to get such a kick, and that black hole would actually find another black hole with 67 solar mass is very less. So that is why people don't think that might not be the case, but it's still not ruled out. Yeah, I do agree. That's what I wanted to mainly point out. As Nishant said, the amount of signal, the duration of the signal, right? During a LIGO event, it's usually around some seconds, an order of seconds, like more than 1 second. But for GW 190521, I think we only observed it for 1 second or less than that. So he asks, so how can we make sure that it's not a glitch? So as I was saying, they did check that it's not a glitch or something by actually doing a lot of analysis and cleaning the data using some signal processing techniques. And then they tried matching it with something called black hole perturbation theory, which actually dictates what is the gravitational wave signal during the ring down part of the waveform, as I showed earlier. So they actually compared and then they made sure that it's not a glitch or anything. So they did do all those tests. Yeah, the dependent variables in a in-spiral waveform are nothing but it depends whether you're plotting in something called time series plot or a frequency plot. It means whether you have an on x-axis whether time or frequency, and so the way the waveform looks, it majorly depends upon the masses of the two black holes, the spins of the two black holes, the orientation, the magnitude and the orientation of the spins of the black holes, and whether the whole binary is like it's whether it's face on or face off, meaning whether the orbital plane is perpendicular to our line of sight or parallel to the line of sight. So, and where is it located in the sky? So it depends on all these parameters and how exactly a gravitational waveform looks. But the main parameters are the masses of the two black holes and the spins, magnitude and orientation. I hope it answered, Abhishek. This train, yeah, so it is in space. Yeah, you can always ask the questions afterwards. Okay. Someone is asking, I think they compare it with the erased patterns of GW from such events, check with other noise curves and try to find. Yeah, that's what I was saying too. They try to compare it with the waveforms that they get and make sure that they're right, and also try to clean any noise that they may not have accounted for. And yeah, they do try to search for EM counterparts. Thank you, Ayushi. Yeah, they do try to find EM counterparts, but Uh, Around black holes, because there is no matter usually, you can't really find a EM counterpart unless there are in such a region where there's a lot of matter. Like supposing you have a supermassive black hole and a huge accretion disk around that supermassive black hole, and supposing this binary black hole system is present inside that accretion disk around the supermassive black hole. uh, and as I said, when these two black holes have merged, they give rise to a remnant with a huge kick, right, with a huge velocity. So when that remnant might have formed, it may have what's a dragged through that accretion disk, and due to the drag effect of the remnant black hole through the accretion disk, accretion material, that may have produced an electromagnetic counterpart. So they say that they found an electromagnetic counterpart, and some people believe that this black hole might have actually been in a accretion disk around a supermassive black hole. But unfortunately, there's a lot of uncertainty because the distance that's measured to this binary black hole system is around z is equal to 0.8, I guess. Yeah, where z is redshift. Uh, and for the electromagnetic counterpart, it's around z is equal to 0.4. So there's two order of magnitudes difference in the distance estimation to this electromagnetic counterpart and the binary black hole event. So we don't yet know for sure if you can associate the potential electromagnetic counterpart with the binary black hole yet. Still more analysis needs to be done. Yeah, that's a good question, Manish. So the amount of mass that's actually converted in this binary black hole event into pure energy, which is nothing but gravitational waves, is 8 solar mass. And if you estimate what is the amount of energy that's contained in 8 solar mass pure energy using E equal to mc square, you'll get somewhere around 10 to the power 55 ergs. And that's a huge, because whenever you look at accretion disks or jets or etc., their energies is around 10 to the power 50, 10 to the power 52 ergs. And imagine this it's three order more magnitude stronger than whatever we found electromagnetic counterparts. So yeah, a lot of energy has been released in this event, 10 to the power 55 ergs. 8 solar mass has been converted in this event. Okay, Dvis has a question. Why does accretion matter here? If the mergers come out to be form a primordial origins, then how is it dependent on this? Because if primordial black holes are so large, then aren't they very small as compared to its size? Okay, called. Okay, the thing is, I'm not an expert on primordial black holes really to comment completely, but I can give you an idea. But if someone else can comment and give a better answer, they can always pitch in after I complete my answer. So the thing is, as far as I remember, hmm, you can't really make primordial black holes to whatever extent you can. They can only start as some micro-sized black holes, which have masses around subsolar mass black holes, which have masses around 10 to the power minus 3, 10 to the power minus 2 solar mass black holes during the early universe. And they start off as black holes with those mass, and they keep accreting mass and increase in their size and mass. That's how the primordial black hole scenario is invoked when people try to explain the black hole formation starting from the early universe to the current day. That initially a lot of subsolar black holes have formed, and as the time progressed and as the universe keep on expanding, etc., and those black holes have accreted matter and increased in terms of their mass and size, because as you know, the size of the black holes is proportional to the mass through the Schwarzschild radius relation. So yeah, and now if you can't actually explain how these black holes might have actually accreted so much matter so that they have started from 0.1 or 10 power minus 2 solar mass and ended up being 80 solar mass. So that's a huge difference, right? It's at least 3 orders of magnitude difference between the masses, 80 solar mass black hole and a 10 to the power minus 3 solar mass black hole. So how did they at all accrete so much matter? Will such astrophysical processes at all happen? So that's the main question. Yeah. So the way they do the distance measurement in binary black holes is actually okay. How to say? Uh, mm, so they actually measure the masses of your system, and once you have masses of your system, you would know how much energy it would have been released. So the thing is, in numerical relativity simulations, right? So I mean, what? Okay, yeah. So in numerical relativity simulations, you take two black holes with certain amount of mass, and you let them orbit around each other. You let them crash into each other and give out gravitational waves. And in that numerical relativity simulation, you actually estimate what is the amount of gravitational waves that is released, okay, from a given certain amount of certain type of black holes, okay, and you do a systematic study, like you take some other pair of black holes, like that you take different pairs of black holes and you look at the amount of energy that's released in each of this pair, and you try to get a fitting formula, okay, which can actually give you, supposing if I include the masses of the, if I input the masses of the black holes that I've detected inside this fitting formula, I'll get the amount of energy that's released in terms of gravitational waves. And if I have the amount of energy of a gravitational waves that is released, and in that LIGO only detects certain amount of gravitational waves, I can infer the distance, right? That's the way. Like at the event, so much gravitational signals have been produced, and by the time it reached Earth, so much is lost, and that loss relation is dependent upon the distance, and based on the amount of gravitational energy that you observe here on Earth using LIGO detectors, and the amount of gravitational energy that they may have produced, which you get by inputting the masses of these black holes in the fitting formula that you get from various numerical relativity simulations of the black holes. There are also some analytical and semi-analytical relations which try to get this fitting formula, which can relate the initial two masses and spins of the black holes and the final remnant mass of the black hole, so that they can subtract these two and get the amount of energy that's released in a gravitational wave signal. So there are a lot of ways to calculate this gravitational wave energy that's released in a event using analytical, semi-analytical, and numerical relativity simulations. And they finally pick the most robust relation, and whatever masses that they got through parameter estimation, they try to get the values and get the energy. And as I said, from there, they get the distance. Yeah, only an approximation is possible, Manish. Yeah, you're right. We cannot know the exact distance. And if you want to go, we can go more deep into this some other time. But I have to say there are more uncertainties in terms of estimating the distance, not just this. So that is why you see on distance, we usually have a huge error bars. And in some cases, you can actually have more error bars on distance, but yeah, we can only get an approximation. But if supposing there is an associated electromagnetic counterpart, right? Like supposing you take a binary neutron star system, that may produce an electromagnetic counterpart. So then you can compare the distance that you get from the electromagnetic counterpart and from the gravitational signal. And if they both match, then it makes sense. And that's one of the ways as to how they estimated the speed of gravitation waves to be speed of light. But we can go through that more later. No, it's not. I mean, I should say, yeah, the detection. Manish is asking, is there any error detection machinery available? I mean, we can estimate the errors because we do know what is causing these errors. Okay, like one, that the modeling errors, like as I was saying, numerical relativity simulations, right? Anything that's computational and numerical, it will always have numerical errors. So we do know what the numerical errors are. And next, when we're estimating or digging out the signal out of the data that you detect at LIGO, we do know that noise will cause some data to be lost. So we'll get some errors, measurement errors too. So there are two types of errors called modeling errors and measurement errors. And do we also take into account of these various measurement and modeling errors when we are actually quoting these numbers on masses and distance? I mean, that is why you see these intervals, right, on mass. They didn't just say that it's 85 solar mass black hole. They said plus or minus 16 or 22. How do you think they got it? They got it because they know the errors. But again, there might be some errors which we don't know of. That's true too. So, but yeah, we do think that we have a good handle on the modeling and measurement errors. So Nishant is asking, is there estimation theory about how much matter accreted black hole in its lifetime? See, one can, yeah, there is a whole set of equations and theory which can actually explain you, given a certain amount of material around a black hole, how does the accretion happen? Like what is the accretion rate? How much mass in that accretion disk actually falls onto the black hole? What is the velocity of those accretion disk? What is the thickness of that accretion disk? What is the radial variation in the thickness of the disk starting from surface of the black hole to the end of the accretion disk? And what is the composition of the accretion disk? To understand all this, there's a lot of theory. And if you're interested, there's actually a book. Let me get that. So we cannot really know how much matter is accreted onto a black hole in its lifetime, because then you have to assume the amount of matter that's present around black hole which can be accreted, right? And that itself we don't know really. You get my point? Like we don't know exactly how much matter is present around a black hole that can be accreted in its entire lifetime, starting from early universe to now. We can only do some population analysis. So if you're interested, we can always discuss that later. So there are some population models which can actually deal with. As I was saying, I'm not really an expert on primordial black holes, to be frank. Okay, just getting accretion power in astrophysics. So this is a very good book, guys. So if you all can, you should definitely go through this. So it deals with all the theory that's related to accretion disks. So if you're interested, you can look at that book, and as usual, you can get the PDF of that copy online somewhere. I don't want to say which websites are those, but yeah, you can always. Okay, the next question is by Manish again. Is there any evidence of parallel universe? Okay, I think we can get into that, but before that, anybody else has any questions? Yeah, any questions? Okay, Viz Hatman, okay. Yeah, you can unmute yourself, as I was saying. Viz, yeah. Sorry, I didn't see the hand raised. Yeah, you can unmute yourself and ask.
Hello. Yeah. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this process of like the merging of black holes, So do you think that is it any helpful for finding the? Okay, just give me a moment. I'm constantly getting distracted. Okay, I just give me. You can continue with. Sorry.
Okay, I hope you'll ask that question. I think it's an interesting question that you are going to ask as to how we can use these binary black hole mergers to do something. Yeah, you can ask that question always. Okay. Okay, yeah. Then I think we'll keep that question to later. Now we'll get into what Manish is asking. So before I answer Manish's question, I would like to point out to some what's it called?
Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry about that. May I continue?
Yeah, just give me a minute. I'm trying to
I think
So Manish and anyone else who is actually interested in this parallel universe kind of stuff, he is Ibrahim Safa. I fortunately worked with him while I was at UW Madison working on particle astrophysics. And he was one of the key authors who authored this paper, which didn't mention parallel universe, but some new and exotic physics. So he gave an interview recently on YouTube, and you can always go to that video. And he explains way better because he himself wrote that paper along with some other collaborators. So you can watch that video. But to give you a simple answer now, no, they haven't found any evidence for parallel universe. No. So the thing is, to briefly explain what actually happened is, okay. So you know there are three types of neutrinos, I'm assuming. I mean, the known types of neutrinos now. There might be more than three types, but the well-known three types of neutrinos are electron neutrinos, tau neutrinos, and muon neutrino. Okay. And when these neutrinos actually travel through some objects or travel through space, they tend to switch between different neutrinos. Like initially a tau neutrino which is produced, it might get converted into a muon neutrino, and a muon neutrino later can be converted into an electron neutrino. So this can actually happen, okay? Uh, this is uh, this is called neutrino oscillation. And so the thing is, if you have actually studied standard model of particle physics and particle physics, wherein if you use quantum chromodynamics and quantum field theory, one can actually estimate what is the interaction cross section of a particular particle is. Okay, fundamental particle is. Like supposing you take a billiard board and you have two balls sitting on them, and they're interacting with each other. And if you remember, during your class 7, class 12, and even later, you must have learned about something called a sphere of influence, right? Supposing in your kinetic theory of gases, right? When you're trying to see if it's an ideal gas or whether you have to include pressure and volume corrections to the ideal gas equation, right? P minus V by NB times no, something, yeah, P minus NB, something, yeah, I forgot the equation. But yeah, you know that equation, right? And as to why those modifications come into picture, it's because you want to include the individual effects of your molecules in your gas. And what are those individual effects? That the molecule has a certain volume, that it can actually interact with other molecules, that they're not collisionless, unlike in ideal gas, okay? And to include the collisions that they can interact with other molecules, you try to derive something called sphere of influence, right? Similarly, uh, every particle, like any fundamental particle, take an electron, proton, neutron, neutrino, any fundamental particle that you know, to interact with a certain other particle, it will have its own sphere of influence, right? That is what we call as interaction cross section, okay? So for a given particle, the interaction cross section depends on the type of particle and on the type of force and the distance between the two particles that are in the question at hand, and also on the energy of the particle. So in the case of neutrino, the interaction cross section actually increases. By interaction cross section increasing, I mean the probability that the neutrino can interact with regular matter keeps increasing if you increase the energy of the neutrino. Okay, by energy of the neutrino, what do I mean? The kinetic energy of the neutrino and the mass of the neutrino. Okay, as you keep increasing these, one can actually increase the interaction cross section of the neutrino. It means it's more possible and probable that the neutrino can actually interact with matter around you. Okay, and now, and you may ask me, so there is this experiment in Antarctica called two experiments, something called Anita, and the other is called Ice Cube. Okay, so these two detectors, which are present in Antarctica, one is present inside ice cube, and Anita is nothing but a gas balloon which floats above the ice cube experiment and detects these particles that are coming from outer space. Okay, and now, what particles do these two detectors detect? They detect something called high energy cosmogenic particles. What particles can these be? They constitute something called cosmic rays and very high energy neutrinos. Okay. And how are these produced? We don't yet know. That is the key question, and that is why all these detectors are built to understand the process of formation of these very high energetic particles, which are cosmic rays and very high energy neutrinos, and where are they produced and how are they produced. So these are the key questions to be answered, and it's still unanswered. We only know that they might be produced inside a jet, around a black hole, around a neutron star, etc. But we don't know yet for sure. So let's leave the question of formation and where they might have formed for a while. But once they are produced, let's assume that they are produced, the cosmic rays and the very high energy neutrinos. Okay. As I was saying, as you keep increasing the energy of the neutrino, the possibility that this neutrino will actually interact with the matter keeps increasing, right? And as you know, the neutrinos that are produced from the sun have energies around mega electron volts. Like electron volt is a unit that's used in particle physics to signify the amount of energy that a particle has. So mega electron volts means somewhere around 10 to the power minus 6 electron volts. So on average, the neutrinos that are produced inside sun due to nucleosynthesis and nuclear transmutation, nuclear burning, etc., is around 10 to the power minus 6 electron volts or something. It may be more than that or less than that. And these neutrinos, when they're actually passing on Earth and through us, they don't affect us at all because the energies are so less, and neutrino can only interact with regular matter weakly, right? It can only interact with regular matter through weak interaction. It cannot interact with strong interaction or electromagnetically because it doesn't have the necessary components which can actually produce this strong force or what you say electromagnetic force, because they don't have charge. Those are weak neutral particles which can only interact with matter through weak force. And how, like, since weak force itself is weak force, that's why it's called weak force. Like it can only interact with regular matter when the energies of the neutrinos are high, so that it can increase the weak force, so that they can interact with the matter. Okay. And now the neutrinos which are produced inside the sun, they have very less energy, so they can't really interact with each other. And that is why people say that some billions of neutrinos are produced every second, and billions of neutrinos actually enter our body, pass through our body, but nothing happens. So yeah, but when you go to these very high energy neutrinos, which have some 10 to the power 15 times the energy, the neutrinos that are 10 to the power 10 times the energies that are produced in the neutrino, around 10 to the power 15, 10 to the power 16 electron volts, their interaction possibility actually increases a lot. Okay. And now that these, we made sure that these very high energy neutrinos can actually interact with matter, there's a more probability, and that they actually change flavors, and all these are established. Now let's move on to what this Anita and IceCube have actually detected. So uh, what happened is this Anita has actually detected some very high energy neutrinos. Okay. So, and the one can also reconstruct the direction from which the neutrinos come from. Like supposing you take a detector, right? You want to know whether it has come from the north direction, south direction, northeast, what is the exact latitude and longitude direction that it has come from. So one can actually reconstruct the direction of this neutrino. How exactly? That's more complicated, but yeah. Once you have reconstructed direction, turns out when Anita has actually detected these neutrinos, they have come from downward. Okay, like supposing you take the Earth, you take the Antarctic, and you're standing on Antarctica, and you have the balloon up in the sky, and Anita has observed this neutrino coming from the downward direction, like from the Earth towards the sky, in that direction. Okay, you get my point? Yeah, in that direction. So if supposing that neutrino has come from the downward direction and has been detected, right? How come it was not detected in IceCube, right? Because if it had come through the Earth, it should have crossed even the IceCube detector, and then left the IceCube detector, and it might have been detected by the Anita, right? I mean, you have to remember, billions of neutrinos are produced, right? Out of billions of neutrinos, only one or two interact with your matter. Okay, not all of them interact. So some a lot of neutrinos actually escape even the ice cube experiment, and they might have been detected by the Anita experiment. But given the amount of neutrinos that are being produced and detected in the Anita, supposing if Anita has detected one neutrino, supposing you can say, then there must have been some billions of neutrinos which have been released. And if there have been millions of neutrinos that have been produced, then it must also have been detected inside the ice cube. So how come ice cube hasn't detected and Anita has detected? That's the question. So that's where they said that maybe there is some parallel universe explanation for this. But there are more simple explanations for this, and for the exact explanation as to why it may not have been detected in the ice cube experiment and has been detected in the upper Anita experiment, what are the possible errors or what are the possible explanations, you can watch the YouTube. I'll leave you to that. So I hope I've answered. Yeah. Yeah, Dries, that's a very nice question. He's asking, can gravitational wave mergers help finding Hubble constant? Yeah, it can. I don't know if everyone actually knows. Uh, so the thing is, we have a lot of discrepancy between the Hubble constant that's measured by the CMBR and that's measured by the supernova, type 1a supernova. So there's a discrepancy, like where type 1a supernova says that the Hubble constant value is around 74 solar mass, but the CMBR says that the value is around 67 value, some units, 67, and uh, type 1a supernova says 74. And we do know that there's this discrepancy. So there should be some other alternate ways of measuring Hubble constant, and gravitational waves can actually do that. How exactly? So that is using binary neutron star systems. Okay. So using binary neutron star systems, you can get two things. One, using gravitational waves, one can get the distance to the object, right? And using the electromagnetic counterparts, one can get both the distance if possible, or uh, using the spectroscopy of the electromagnetic light, you can get the velocity of that particular object which has produced, right? And if you have the velocity and if you have the distance, you can get the Hubble constant. That's how Hubble constant can actually be measured in a binary neutron star system, not binary black hole system. But if supposing even in a binary black hole system, somehow one can produce an electromagnetic signal, they might be used to infer the value of Hubble constant. So far, people found out that we need at least some 20 to 30 binary neutron star merger to get a precise value of Hubble constant, so that one can actually validate it against the value that's obtained from CMB or type 1a supernova and say whether there is a new need of physics to explain the difference between this measured value Hubble constant, or whether CMB is correct and somehow uh, type 1a is wrong, or type 1a is correct and CMB is wrong. Yeah, from Hubble constant, as Manish is asking, we can describe the expansion of the universe. And sometimes, we only know the distance to the object and we want to know the velocity of the object. Or sometimes we only know the velocity of object and we want to know what is the distance. And how do you get this velocity? You get this by spectroscopic studies, right? So based on when you want to better understand the spectroscopy of your system, by spectroscopy, I don't mean anything. They're nothing but a sheet, a spectrogram, wherein you have some absorption lines in the electromagnetic spectrum, where those absorption lines correspond to some atomic element, where the photons have been absorbed because of the presence of an atom or some molecule, and that line or that particular electromagnetic line is missing in your electromagnetic spectrum, and this electromagnetic spectrum is actually redshifted because of expansion of the universe. So if you know the Hubble constant, you know how much redshift. If you know how much redshift, one can get the exact spectroscopy of the object. And if you know what is the exact spectroscopy of your spectrogram of your object, you can know what is the exact composition of your object. And if you know the exact composition of the object, then comes how can you get that composition in that object. That's one of the questions we want to understand, right? Like what sun is made of. What if there is some other star which is pretty far away and we can't really get a lot of light from it, and you want to understand what is the composition of it, then you have to accurately account for the redshift, right? If you don't accurately account for the redshift, you will not know by how much the wavelengths of these spectral lines have shifted to. So if you want to know accurate compositions of your system or the accurate distance of your system, you need to know the accurate value of your Hubble constant. And not only that, it's also useful in terms of validating cosmological models, something called lambda CDM cosmology, which model can explain the Hubble constant. Why is the value of Hubble constant the way it is? So if you want to validate those models also, measuring Hubble constant is important. We don't yet know whether the Hubble constant changes. I mean, we're calling it constant. So we don't know whether Hubble constant keeps changing with time or not. As of now, we think it's a constant. Whether it changes with respect to time or not, we don't know. If it changes, then it's no more a constant, Hubble constant, as Abhishek is asking. Okay, Nishant is asking, as we're discussing about parallel universe, can you give some information about string theory and loop quantum gravity? I guess we can put that question to the last, supposing there is time, enough time. Okay, how can the standard, Dviz is asking, how can the standard model broke for finding the neutrino massless and experimentally it shows mass, and why are people investing so much money on discovery of axions? I think, like what if they detect a neutrinos and it has a similar behavior? I mean, we don't yet know, right? What axion is a potential particle for dark matter, and we don't yet know, completely understand what is a viable candidate for dark matter. And we can only rule out the probable candidates for dark matter by conducting some experiments or constructing some detectors. And yeah, we don't yet know completely whether neutrino is mass or massless. So even that's a big question. That's something that we want to understand. And all of this boil down to what? Because we want to know there are a lot of loophole, a lot of free parameters, and a lot of holes in our understanding of the basic fundamental theory of how particles are made of and interact. So all of this can only be answered by these various detectors, observatories, etc. That's the main goal. Okay, next, this is asking that since there were two accurate methods of finding the Hubble constant, how are they different? That's the thing. We don't know whether both are accurate. That's the thing. We want to know whether CMBR measurement is correct or whether type 1a supernova is correct. We don't yet know. I mean, recently there have been studies showing that maybe type 1a supernova is not a reliable source to measure the supernova Hubble constant. Maybe CMBR is not a right way to measure the Hubble constant. Maybe there is some systematic error or measurement error. So we don't yet know. That's the thing we want to know. And that is why we're trying to look at alternate ways of measuring Hubble constant so that we'll know which particular model has to be refined or modified to explain the required Hubble constant, whether CMBR or type 1a supernova. Okay. So Pratik is asking, how do we measure the Hubble constant using CMBR radiation? I mean, I can answer it, but then again, we'll leave it for some other time. Even that takes a long time, sorry. But to give you a basic idea, we actually have something called lambda CDM cosmological model, okay? It's a set of equations which tells you how does the universe evolve with time. And it also tells you what is the wavelength of the CMBR that's produced in the early universe. And if supposing you have a certain expansion of the universe, then the CMBR might have redshifted to lower wavelengths or to higher wavelengths or to lower frequencies in a certain way. So since currently we observe it as microwave radiation, it means it can only have a certain value for the Hubble constant. That's one way of simply stating how we can measure Hubble constant from CMBR. But there's a lot more formulae analysis involved. which we'll cover in the upcoming astrocosmology workshop. Recommending an undergrad book for gravitational waves on GR. That okay, okay for gravitational waves. I don't know the author name exactly, but these are some of the best books that are out there in the market. I'm trying. So they start from scratch and then they go on. So you can look up this. And for GW, I would say Hartley. Yeah, this book. But yeah, we'll come to the resources, etc., in the upcoming workshop, as I promised. I don't think we looked at any papers, but I hope today's discussion was useful for you all. Let me know if there are any other questions.
I had one doubt.
Yeah, Abhishek.
Hello.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry. The reason why I asked Hubble constant is a constant because in our postgraduate degree, I mean in our graduation, we found Hubble constant using the distance versus velocity graph.
Yeah.
So we found so the velocity was found by the redshift of the this thing any celestial object, and then the distance and the velocity were plotted, and then the slope of it gave the Hubble's constant. Now, if but we also know that the objects are not just moving with the velocity, but they're accelerating. And do we know that if the universe is accelerating at a uniform rate, or is it not going? So that is why I asked if Hubble constant is really a constant. So that was my intention behind. I don't know the CMBR method of finding Hubble's constant. Because I did this, I followed up on that part.
Okay. Mm. Mm. So the thing is, when you're considering acceleration, see, you have to remember that accordingly the velocities will change, right? I mean, it's incorporated in the velocities. Like supposing it is uh, accelerating, it will have a higher velocity, but the velocity of the object itself, which will not change on the time scales of your observations. You get my point? Like supposing you're observing,
Yes, yes.
yeah, supposing you're observing a certain object,
Uh,
it will not instantly accelerate. It will take some time to actually change from one velocity to the other velocity. But when that velocity comes, accordingly, the distance will also change, obviously, because the space is expanding, keeping the Hubble constant.
okay. Okay. Sorry for that.
Yeah. I mean, that's a
Uh,
very good question, because people are actually trying to see if there is such a system which we can actually observe in our lifetimes or in certain amount of time, so that one can actually measure the exact acceleration. And there are certain systems like binary White-Dwarf mergers. They think that they might be possible to use them to actually look at the acceleration of the universe in them by looking at the change in the gravitational signal. So
oh,
yeah, but in all the other objects, yeah, you really can't. The time scales are too small. Yeah, the
thank you.
observation. Okay, now Manish is asking, is there any possibility in the future we can determine the length of the universe, means where the universe ends? I think practically is not possible. but in the future we get advanced technology, is there any chance? If yes, what kind of technology we need in principle of working? So as per the current understanding of our universe based on general theory of relativity, there is no boundary for the universe. And the only example that I can give you is that we're supposing a two-dimensional being living on a three-dimensional sphere. If you ask me, what is the boundary for a two-dimensional being living on a three-dimensional sphere, I would say there is none, right? There is no boundary for a two-dimensional being on a three-dimensional sphere. Similarly, you have to translate this into a three-dimensional being living on a four-dimensional universe. But can you imagine that? You can't. Unfortunately, we can't imagine four dimensions. We're restricted to only being able to imagine three dimensions. So I can only give you an analogy saying that supposing if we were two-dimensional beings and if we were living on a three-dimensional sphere, then you don't have a border. So there is no end to the universe, where the universe ends. Yeah, I hope that answered. Okay, I hope I didn't miss any question too. Supposing if I missed any question, you can always raise your hand. Okay, we're going to the last. I think we'll go for 5-10 more minutes and we'll stop. 5 more minutes maybe. Any question you may have regarding astrocosmology, raise your hand or put it in the chat. I'll wait for 1 minute to give you all some time. Okay, Abhishek has a question.
Hi. So, what are the undergrad and graduate courses that one should be familiar with? With all the theoretical work that you mentioned about programming and stuff. But what are the general graduate and undergraduate courses that one should be well familiar with if one wants to do a PhD in this kind of a thing? Is it enough with if we know the general the advanced I mean the classical mechanics and mathematical methods part, or is it we need to know something else or something?
Yeah, during my undergrad, I can tell you the courses that I did. I didn't even have a formal physics degree, by the way. I was having my engineering degree. So I could only do some limited amount of physics courses. And I did quantum mechanics, electromagnetic theory, and theoretical neuroscience, nonlinear dynamics. So I would say the basic courses that are required are quantum mechanics 1, quantum mechanics 2, if possible, like Schrodinger equation, hydrogen atom, understanding how to solve a given Schrodinger equation given a potential, and how to get a wave function, how to get the expectation of that wave function, how to work with annihilation operators, simple harmonic oscillator system, hydrogen atom. And after that, if you can and if it's possible, you can also look at the perturbation theory in quantum mechanics or the angular momentum in quantum mechanics. I think those are more than enough. And classical mechanics, if you can understand what is a Lagrangian is, what is a Hamiltonian is, how can you get equations of motion, conservative quantities for a given system of equations, or supposing I want to add some dissipation terms to my system and I want to understand how can you model these dissipation terms into the Lagrangian Hamiltonian equations and equations of motion. That's essential. And then you need to know statistical mechanics. So yeah, in statistical mechanics, you want to understand what are microstates, what are the different ensembles, micro ensemble, canonical ensemble, grand canonical ensemble. How do you get the properties of the gas? Like how do you derive them? Like temperature, pressure, equation of state for your gas, starting from some microscopic properties of the gas. It's similar to your kinetic theory of gases, the statistical mechanics. It's just a different approach. So yeah, you need to know statistical mechanics. And apart from that, electromagnetic theory. You want to know what is the Maxwell's equation, how were they formulated, some examples that are they applied to, how to get an electromagnetic wave, uh, dipoles, how two dipoles interact, etc. And special relativity, yeah, that is something essential. Like what is special relativity? What is space-time? How does time transform? How it's related to spatial transformations? And if possible, an introduction to general relativity, if it is possible. Else, it's no problem, and you can always learn on your own. So yeah, quantum mechanics, electromagnetic theory, statistical mechanics, classical mechanics, mathematical methods for physics, special relativity. Those are the essential ones. On top of which, you can do any other course like new if you want to. But these are the basic essential ones.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's what. No, I mean, the way we estimate the age of the universe is by looking at the expansion rate, um, what's it, by assuming a model, by taking an evolution for the universe. We'll come to that later. I mean, there are a lot of other equations involved. Uh, yeah. I mean, we use CMBR even for that to estimate the age of the universe. There are some other ingredients. Yeah, as Manish pointed out, we need other parameters. As per my understanding the proper length of yeah, that's how you understood it correctly. Um, yeah, that's the time in light years, and if one wants to translate it into distance, that's the distance. But then you also have to consider for the case that the universe is also expanding. So you need to include the expansion. You can't just multiply velocity of light with the time of the universe, lifetime of the universe, so that you can get the uh, say the distances to different sources. So yeah, it's not just simply multiply. You need to consider the expansion too, Harthi. Okay, any more questions? You can raise your hand if you want. I'll give you 1 more minute again. And I hope you people will attend what's the workshop, because there'll be other similar topics and more discussions, etc. And you'll learn a lot more from basics. Okay. Yeah, thank you. I hope you people found it very useful, interesting. Yeah. Okay, I think we'll end with this last question from Nishant. From about string theory and loop quantum gravity. Okay, the thing is, we can't really combine both gravity and quantum mechanics because you see, when you're dealing with quantum mechanical systems, if you have ever written an equation, you always write it as function of space and time, right? It means you're assuming a background space-time, okay, which has certain structure. It can be a Euclidean space-time or a Minkowski space-time. So special relativistic quantum mechanics considers Minkowski space-time, wherein regular quantum mechanics considers Euclidean space-time, wherein space and time are disentangled and can be treated separately. Okay, that's the structure of space-time in quantum mechanics and special relativistic quantum mechanics, which is nothing but quantum field theory. Okay, but in order to account for the general relativistic effects in quantum mechanics, right? First, it only makes sense to consider the general relativistic effects of quantum mechanics when the scale of your system is comparable to the curvature that your particular system produces. Okay, supposing you take an atom, how much gravity does it have? Right, it doesn't have so much gravity, so it cannot produce a huge curvature. Since it can't produce a huge curvature, it cannot really change the structure of space-time itself. So you can safely assume either a Minkowskian space-time or a Euclidean space and time, and go with your regular quantum mechanics. But there are some situations like at the center of black hole or at the beginning of the universe when you don't just have one atom in that particular amount of volume, like say 1 femtometer or something. I forgot what is the radius of atom is, but I think it's around 1 femtometer. So 1 femtometer is some 10 power minus 9 or 10 power minus 10 meters. So supposing, imagine not just one atom, but rather uh, putting a lot of mass inside that 1 femtometer volume, then the amount of curvature that produces would be a lot, right? Then your space-time structure itself changes, and it keeps changing. It might keep changing too. It might be dynamical. It might not be a stationary space-time. So, and as you go down to those scales, you also have something called perturbations. Okay, these perturbations, quantum perturbations, might actually also change the structure of your space-time at those scales. So, in this scenario where the gravity is so strong that one can actually not ignore the effects of gravity, and that one cannot go take away space-time being a Minkowskian or Euclidean, one has to consider a quantum gravity. And you can no longer use your regular quantum mechanics where the space-time structure is given by Euclidean or Minkowskian. You need to modify your quantum mechanics. So you cannot take a fixed space-time on which you can define all your quantum mechanical observables and functions. You need to have a dynamical space-time or a different space-time structure, and you should be able to define your quantum mechanics on top of that. So that is the main problem as to why loop quantum gravity and string theory are required. And that's where they're required. But I think, yeah, so in terms of parallel universes, so the thing is, in string theory, there is a way to produce something called bubble universes. I mean, it also comes from inflation. I mean, so supposing you take two patches, okay, uh, two patches in your space-time, and as the inflation occurs, okay, these two patches of space-time will start moving away from them, right? And as you know, speed of light is constant. And where do you get this from? From the postulate of special theory of relativity. Like special relativity assumes that speed of light is constant. It has also been experimentally proven, and now it's a fact. The speed of light is constant, okay? And no other information can actually move faster than speed of light. That's also a fact that comes from special theory of relativity, okay? And now we have established that nothing can travel faster than speed of light. No information or no physical thing can travel faster than speed of light. Then supposing these two patches which have initially started when the inflation has brought these two patches of what's a sky far apart, so that even if you travel at speed of light, that other patch might actually be traveling at the speed of light itself or more than that itself, right? The space-time might actually be expanding at that certain patch more than the speed of light. It means even if you travel with the speed of light, it won't be able to catch up with the other patch. It means these two patches of the sky become causally disconnected. It means this universe cannot communicate with the other universe because these two universes are moving away from them at a speed greater than the speed of light. So these two universes might actually be what are called bubble universes, and that might be one of the way on how you can produce parallel universes. But there are a lot of other ways one can produce, like if you take general theory of relativity, there is something called a concept of black hole and white hole, wherein they say that there are two different universes and it's connected by a black hole and a white hole. But I don't subscribe to that idea. It's a very crazy idea. Nobody actually believes in that. So yeah, because we don't yet know what's inside a black hole is. We don't yet know, to be sure, to be frank. We only know what is on the horizon of the black hole and what is surrounding the black hole. We don't know what exactly is inside the black hole. So yeah. And loop quantum gravity, as far as I know, it doesn't really say anything about parallel universes. I don't think I've read any. But if you have come across anything where loop quantum gravity suggested that there are parallel universes, please do share the link. Yeah. Okay. Okay, guys, I think we'll stop with this. And as usual, you can always put your feedback. I think I can stop recording.